Hello and welcome. My name's Sherida Phibbs, and I am thrilled to have you joining us today for the third session of our four-part sourdough adventure. A little bit about us and what we do. We are the University of California Cooperative Extension Master Food Preservers, and we are with the San Joaquin County program. We are a dedicated team of volunteers who are passionate about food preservation and food safety. We do not endorse or recommend any specific brands or manufacturers of the products demonstrated or mentioned in our presentations. Our focus is purely on sharing unbiased information to help you preserve food safely and successfully. You will want to jot down our website to where you will find all the recordings, handouts, and recipes. For those who were not with us before, let me briefly describe this four-part presentation. Now, for those who missed either session 1 or session 2, I encourage you to watch the recorded presentations on our website. Now, in session 1, we dove into the fascinating science of sourdough fermentation. We learned about the natural processes that make sourdough unique. And we also covered the essential equipment, ingredients, and supplies that are needed to start your sourdough culture. And we also spoke about the different flour types and how to keep it fresh and cross-contamination concerns. Now, in session 2, we learned how to craft sourdough starter from scratch. I explained how to work with dehydrated starters, and I gave you tips on maintaining your starter. I want you to keep it healthy and active. Now, today is our third session, and we will focus on crafting breads, muffins, and more using your sourdough culture. And I will walk you through the process and I will explain the whys. Now, in session 4, coming up in September, is our final session, and we are going to celebrate your baking triumphs. You're going to share your successes, and we will also tackle any challenges that you've encountered with a troubleshooting segment to help you perfect your sourdough baking skills. Again, thank you for being here, and let's get started. We'll look at my baking routine and how you can adjust it to fit your schedule. We'll get into the dough making process with demonstrations. That would be the leaven, bulk fermentation, building gluten with the stretch and folds, cold retarding, forming the loafen and the muffin, and the baking. And we'll also dive into baker's percentages and hydrations. A quick review on what I introduced last month, and that was how we feed our starters. Now, we are doing 100% starter hydration, which means it's the same flour and water ratio. For instance, a 1-2-2 ratio would be 1 part of your existing starter, 2 parts flour, and 2 parts water. So we were using 25 grams of our existing starter, and then we added 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. Now, if you find that your starter is starving between feedings, you can increase it to a 1-3-3 or even a greater ratio. So for instance, a 1-3-3 would be 1 part starter, 3 parts flour, and 3 parts flour. And that would be 25 grams of starter, 75 grams of flour, and 75 grams of water, giving us 175 grams. Remember, when you refrigerate your starter, you increase your ratio to best work to how often you will bake or you want to feed it. Now, I keep my established starter in the refrigerator, and I feed it when I bake, which is typically every 2 weeks. I find with my starter, a 1-3-3 ratio works perfectly fine for me. There is the refreshment. We recently fed it. It starts to expand in its container, and then it peaks. It has eaten all of its available food, and it starts to fall, meaning it has peaked, it's eaten its food, and it's beginning to deflate. And then it's fallen. It has deflated back to its original marker. It becomes hungry, and you start seeing fewer bubbles. It becomes thinner, and then it's hangry. It's starving. It smells bad. The hooch develops, and even that bad mold can start to develop. You will need to learn to read your starter. Now, don't get impatient and feed it too soon, and only feed when the starter's peaked and it's starting to fall. And if you feed before it peaks, you will weaken your starter as the yeast cells, they are still building. And if you discard when the yeast population is low, then you start off with an even lower yeast population. Now, this is my baking routine. I do it over 3 days. Day 1, which is a very quick day, like 5-10 minutes at the max, I'll make my leaven. Now, the leaven is the sourdough starter that you use in your recipe. So at 8:30 at night, I am going to pull it out of the refrigerator, and I am going to feed it a 133. And that's based on my kitchen's ambient temperature of 78 degrees. And that will allow me on day 2 to make my dough. And I start that at 8:30 to 9 o'clock in the morning. I will then, after making the dough, it goes into bulk fermentation and our stretch and folds. Then it gets cold retarded into the refrigerator until it's baked. And on day 3, I can bake it at any time of the day. And also, if I want, I can even go to day 4 and bake it on that day. Now, you too can develop your sourdough baking routine to best fit your schedule. Now, to create a personalized sourdough routine that aligns with your schedule, consider the following factors. You need to understand your starter's feeding ratio and the temperature of your environment and how it affects fermentation. Remember, the warmer the temperature, it accelerates fermentation, while slower temperatures slow it down. So monitor your kitchen's ambient temperature and the temperature of your leaven during the feeding, and also the dough fermentation. So let's make an artisan bread loaf. Now, the recipe I provided on our website is an easy bread for beginners and those who like working with a medium level hydration recipe. Now, this recipe only includes bread flour, water, and salt. I recommend baking a single loaf 3 times on different days. It takes 3 bakes to develop the skill and intuition. It is the combination of the knowledge, skill, practice, and intuition that will help you turn out great bakes. Take notes during these bakes, especially with the timing and the temperatures, as this will help you learn and adjust for the next bake. Now, sourdough intuition plus hands-on skills plus having the knowledge, it all equals to amazing bread. So the first thing we want to do is read our recipe and understand the process. As with any time we prepare food in our kitchens, we are going to clean and sanitize the countertops. We're going to remember to wash our hands each time before we handle food product. And we are going to pull out all of the necessary ingredients, supplies, and equipment that is needed to make our dough. So day 1, we are going to prepare our leaven. Let me explain the difference between sourdough starter and the leaven. I want you to think of your sourdough starter as the mother, it's a mixture of wild yeast and bacteria that you maintain indefinitely. And you use it to create other sourdough components. It's like the heart of your sourdough baking. Now, the leaven is an offshoot of your starter. So you take a portion of your starter and you prepare it specifically for your bread recipe. Now, I don't like to keep a large starter, and I don't like to waste flour. So my method is a hybrid. My method is to make the leaven for the specified grams as called for the recipe, and I add 50 grams to that. Now that additional 50 grams has now become my new mother starter. So let me explain. I pull out of the refrigerator my starter, which is 50 grams. My recipe calls for 300 grams of leaven. And I feed my starter a 1:3:3 ratio, which will give me a total of 350 grams. I will also use 300 grams as my leaven for the baking. And the remaining 50 grams goes back into the refrigerator as my mother's starter. And it rests there until I'm ready to bake again. I now have my leaven for my baking and 50 grams of my mother's starter. Now, let me point out that by doing it this way, I never have any discard. And also, when I feed for my leaven, the starter portion, the 50 grams, immediately goes back into the refrigerator. It does not sit out overnight because if it does, it will eat up all of its food. You will discover what works best for you. Remember, take in consideration how your ambient temperature affects the feeding ratio and how long it takes to peak, and work within your dough making schedule as I explained in the previous slide. So when is the leaven ready to use for baking? Well, did it double within the usual amount of time for your starter, considering the ambient temperatures and the feeding ratio? You want to make sure that it hasn't deflated more than a half an inch. And did it float? Now, how it reacts as a starter, it will be similar to how it performs in your bread dough. So if it didn't pass the readiness test, then it won't be able to rise your bread dough as sufficiently. And if this is the case, just refresh it again until it's ready. Now, also remember that if a leaven is weak, it will result in the yeast lagging. And the gluten structure can break down due to bacterial enzyme actions. It turns your dough into a soupy mess, and that will not rise when it's baked. I first check to see if my leaven is ready. It is more than doubled, and it passes the float test. Now, I like using a clear, heavy glass container to mix and ferment. And a heavy glass or ceramic container, it will hold the temperature better than a stainless steel or plastic container. And a container that will hold the temperature better, it helps with fermentation. Also, a clear glass container, it will allow you to watch the rise and the formation of the gas bubbles in the dough. So we place the bowl on the scale and we tare the scale to bring it to 0. And then we will pour the leaven into the mixing bowl and weigh it to the specified grams as called for in the recipe. Next, we will tare the scale to bring it to 0 again, and we are going to add our 80 to 90 degrees water, and we are going to mix it well. Now, by using the warmer water, it will help to bring the flour mixture to temperature faster for a good fermentation. Also, a tip I have for you is during the winter time, when your kitchen is below 75 degrees, it is helpful to heat the mixing bowl as well. Mixing your leaven with the water first, it ensures that the leaven is thoroughly mixed and evenly dispersed. Now, I use just a spatula, but you can also use a stainless steel whisk. And that might even be more beneficial because it will add additional air into your mixture. So next we are going to tare the scale to 0 again, and we're going to add our bread flour, and we're going to mix it well. Using a rigid silicone spatula, I will use to mix it, and then I will use a silicone bowl scraper to finish it up. Now, you can also use your clean, wet hands as well. However, I don't like using my hands at this point because the flour and the water mixture. It is extremely sticky, and it's difficult to remove that sticky mess from your fingers. Never add more flour, as this changes the hydration level of your dough. Now, you can also mix using your heavy-duty stand mixer on low speed with a dough hook. And you only want to mix it until you have a shaggy dough, and don't proceed and knead it. You do not want to knead it with a mixer. However, I don't use a stand mixer as I do not want another thing to clean up. Now we are going to cover the bowl in autolyse for 30 to 60 minutes. Now, autolyse is a French word that refers to the breakdown and the activation of gluten. And during this stage, the flour is becoming hydrated. You know, flour takes time to fully absorb water. And flour naturally contains the enzymes, and during autolyse, these enzymes, they become activated, breaking down the proteins and making the dough stretchy. And this is also the time that bulk fermentation starts. So jot down that time and the temperature of your dough. Now, we do not add salt at this time. Salt is added after the autolyse period, and I will explain why in our next slide. Salt is added after autolyse. Let me give you a tip so you never forget to add your salt. Weigh out your salt into a separate container and place it on top of the cover or the lid. This way you won't forget to add the salt, which is really easy to do. Now, after autolyse, you will start to notice that the shaggy dough is starting to become smoother, flatter, and wetter. Now, as you will see, I will sprinkle the salt onto the dough. I will wet my fingers and my hands and poke the salt into the dough, and then using a silicone bowl scraper, I'll mix in the salt by folding the dough. Now, salt is added after the autolyse phase in sourdough bread making for these reasons. During autolyse, flour and water, they combine to form a shaggy dough. Allowing this rest period, it helps the gluten develop naturally. And adding salt before autolyse, it can hinder gluten formation because salt can toughen the dough by interfering with protein hydration. Autolyse activates the enzymes in the flour, which break down the starches into simpler sugars. Now, these sugars, they feed the yeast during fermentation. And salt can inhibit the enzyme activity, so it's best to add it after autolyse. However, salt is necessary as it enhances the flavor texture and helps with fermentation. Now, remember what I said earlier. Bulk fermentation started after mixing the leaven, water, and flour, and during the autolyse period. During that time, the gluten proteins are meandering around in the water and the dough. and they're joining up with each other to form a gluten network. Now, during bulk fermentation, you will also perform a series of stretch and folds spaced 30 minutes apart. Now, with each set of stretch and folds, the dough transforms from that shaggy, tough ball into a satin ball, and it starts to be less sticky. When we do a stretch and fold, we are giving the proteins a tug to help them link up with new binding partners. Always remember to wet your hands to help handle the dough. And after the set, cover the dough between sets. Now, remember, we do the sets 30 minutes apart. So let's talk about salts. Now, when making sourdough bread, the type of salt you use is a matter of personal preference. However, there are some common options. There is the table salt, which is fine to use. It dissolves readily in the dough. It's convenient, it's affordable, but it can oversaturate the dough if it's added too quickly. It could potentially affect the crumb structure. I can also say that many expert bakers shy away from table salt. Sea salt, which is a coarser grain, and it has a distinct flavor. Now, sea salt, it enhances sourdough, and it is a popular choice among bakers. Kosher salt has larger flakes, and it has no additives. It's great for sourdough due to its texture and its flavor. And Himalayan pink salt, it's known for its vibrant hues, subtle complexity, and it's another interesting option. Now, we should always weigh our salt because of the various sizes of the granules. Accurate salt measurements, it matters. You want to use a kitchen scale to weigh your salt rather than rely on volume measurements. Now, this ensures consistency and it avoids over and under salting the bread. Now, we want to aim for 1 to 2% of the flour's weight, and that's baker's percentages. Now, for example, in a dough with 500 grams of flour, we will use between 5 and 10 grams of salt. I will cover baker's percentages later. Salt also helps with proper crust browning. It does not kill the yeast, but it does help to regulate its activities. It's been about 30 minutes now, and we will do the second set of our stretch and folds. And we perform an additional 2 to 3 sets stretch and folds following this, each 30 minutes apart. Now, check the dough temperature to help determine the bulk fermentation time. Now, the ideal temperature is 75 to 78. Now, currently, my dough right now is reading at 79. And this helps me to estimate the total bulk fermentation time. Now, based on my records from my previous bakes, I estimate that with a temperature of 79, the total bulk fermentation time will be approximately 4.5 to 5 hours. Now, remember to always wet your hands with water before handling the dough. And the stretch and fold technique is crucial for these reasons. Now, during bulk fermentation, you gently stretch the dough and you fold it back onto itself. And this helps develop the gluten structure without the strenuous kneading. And a stronger dough can trap the gas and hold its shape during the baking. And stretching and folding, it helps to distribute heat evenly through the dough, promoting consistent fermentation. So we're going to continue to stretch and fold until you notice there isn't much stretch left in the dough. Then we're going to turn the dough seam side down, and we're always going to cover the dough after each set to prevent it from drying out. It is now rested for 30 minutes, and we are on to the third set. As you see the dough expansion, and the dough becomes silkier and it's sticking less to the bowl. With each set of stretch and folds, you're assessing how the dough is fermenting. It's a chance to observe its strength and adjust as necessary. Now, the technique, it traps a little air in the dough, contributing to a lighter, more airier crumb structure. I did less stretch and folds on this set than I did on the previous set. I will turn it seam side down, cover it, and I'll let the dough rest for another 30 minutes. This is set 4, and this is my last set of stretch and folds. Now, we can see how beautiful the dough is looking. And at this point, it does not take many stretches and folds. I will then turn the dough seam side down and cover it again. Now, at this point, it already has about 2 hours into the bulk fermentation. Remember, the bulk fermentation, it started back when we started the auto lease. Now, based on the dough's temperature of 79, I estimate that it will bench rest for an additional 2 to 3 hours until the next step, which is the pre-shaping. It was a total of 5 hours for bulk fermentation, and I will speak about fermentation later. After the bulk ferment, it's time to shape the dough into loaves. And unlike with commercial bread making, we do not punch down the dough. Our goal is to shape the loaf in a way that preserves as much of the gluten and the bubble networks as possible. We want to aim for an open crumb, so we try to keep some of the puffiness during the shaping of the loaf. To turn out the dough, mist your counter with a light amount of water. Remember, the dough is going to be very sticky at this point, but resist the temptation to add flour at this point, as this is only going to upset the hydration level of your dough. Look how much this dough has expanded, but we want to make sure it didn't over ferment. We do not want to overproof it. Now this batch, it expanded about 80%, as it will continue to ferment during the cold retard stage. Now, if you touch the dough only with wet hands, you won't have a problem with the stickiness. So use the silicone bowl scraper to help remove it from the bowl. I did a finger poke to double check the readiness of this as well. Now I make a double batch, so I will divide my dough into 2 loaves. And after they are baked, I will cut the loaf in half, wrap it in foil, and place it in a freezer Ziploc bag to use at another time. Sourdough bread, it freezes extremely well, and you never store your bread in a refrigerator. Now, I made the mistake of using wax paper when making this video, and I'll never do that again, as the dough was stuck to the wax paper and I had to pick pieces of the wax paper off the dough. It resulted in a smaller loaf and a great deal of frustration. I weigh the dough to get the total weight, and I divide it by 2, and now I will cut the dough into half. And this is when using that bench knife comes in handy. Now, the longer the dough rested on the wax paper, the more they glued together, and it was an awful, awful mess. I spray my work surface again, making it easier to work with the dough. Next, we will pre-shape our loaves. To shape the dough into a loaf, we will stretch it into the desired form gradually to prevent tearing. Now, we do this in stages. We want to allow the dough to rest in between so the gluten can relax and be ready for the next stretch. Gently stretch the dough into a rough rectangle and be careful not to tear it. And you're going to fold the dough onto itself. So you're going to bring the top edge down to the center, then the bottom edge down to the center or up to the top. And then we're going to repeat that with the sides. We're going to bring them towards the center. I then drag and turn the loaf to help stretch the skin and provide tension to the skin, as this helps it too. Now, this pre-shaping and the shaping process, it also redistributes the dough. It enables the yeast to find new pockets of flour, which will also help the loaf to rise. Now, after we pre-shape, we will cover and let this bench rest for 10 to 15 minutes. And during the bench rest, the gluten relaxes. It makes it easier to shape on our next round. And the dough will spread into a flattened mound. And the degree of flattening, it depends on the flour used, the hydration level, and the quality of your gluten network. Now, typically, the dough should relax for about 10 to 15 minutes, and it should still maintain a mound shape with a rounded edge where it meets the counter. Now, if the dough flattens dramatically or too rapidly, or if the edge slopes down to the counter, you will need to do a second pre-shaping because that can help add more strength to the dough. Our next step is to form and shape the loaves and put them into proofing baskets. And at this point, we will not use water. Instead, we will use a small amount of the bread flour for our hands and on the work surface. Now, I like using the silicone mat. It makes cleanup easier. Let me give you a tip when working with these mats. To keep the mat from slipping, mist the countertop with water lightly, then place your mat down, and this will hold the mat in place and it won't slip on you. Now, there are various methods to form your loaf depending on the shape of the loaf and even different methods amongst bakers. For this bowl shape, I pull the edge of the dough and I bring it to the center, and I continue around until I have formed a round loaf. Now, this method, it also helps with stretching the skin and providing that tension. And after forming the loaf, we're going to turn the seam side down to the work surface, and this will allow the seam to meld together. We want to have a nice tight skin, so we will continue to tighten that skin of the loaf by pulling and turning the loaf while it drags on the work surface. Rotate and do it several times. Now, a bench knife, it might be helpful during the process. Be gentle when forming the loaf. We want to keep as much of the puffiness as possible, and we do not want to destroy all the work that the yeast has done to this point. Now, after forming the loaf and tightening the skin, we will dust the top of the loaf and the bottom of the proofing basket with white rice flour. And we will next place the loaf seam side up, which is the bottom of the loaf, and the top of the loaf will rest at the bottom of the proofing basket. We will cover it with plastic to prevent the dough from drying out. Now, I like using thin disposable shower caps as they are inexpensive and reusable. I buy a package of 100 for a very reasonable price. Now, white rice flour is often preferred for dusting your proofing baskets for these reasons. It has a fine texture that makes it less likely to absorb moisture from the dough, and it helps keep a barrier between the dough and the basket. It helps to prevent the dough from sticking, and it makes it easier to transfer the dough from the basket to the baking surface. And unlike whole grain flours, white rice flour has a neutral flavor, and it does not alter the taste of the bread. So this ensures that the flour used for dusting, it does not interfere with the desired flavor profile of your bread. It is also naturally gluten-free, which means it won't contribute to the gluten network of the dough. And this can be particularly beneficial for your sourdough bread when the goal is to control the gluten structure precisely. Now, also, the light color, the white rice flour, it blends well with most types of bread dough. It maintains the aesthetic appearance of a loaf. It does not leave unnoticeable, or it does not leave noticeable dark streaks or patches on the crust when it's baked. And using it for dusting and proofing basket, it helps to ensure that the dough maintains its shape and the texture, leading to a beautifully baked loaf with an excellent crust and crumb. Now, let me explain why we tighten the skin on our loaf. A tight skin, it helps maintain the shape of a loaf during the proofing and the baking. It provides the structural integrity, preventing the dough from spreading out too much. It also contributes to a better crumb structure. Now, the tension, it helps to trap the gases that are produced during fermentation, and it leads to a more open and airy crumb. In a tight skin, it aids in achieving a good oven spring, which is that rapid rise of the dough when it first hits the oven's heat. Now, this results in a more pronounced and appealing loaf shape. It helps to form a crisp and well-developed crust, and the surface tension allows for better caramelization and browning during the baking. Now, there are two methods to proof your dough. There's the warm proofing, which occurs during the bench resting. It allows you to bake the same day. And then there's the cold retard. Now, cold retard, it proofs in the refrigerator. In this method, it slows down the fermentation process. Now, most of the rise, it occurs during the first 3 hours of retardation, and the flavor continues to develop. Now, the benefits are it allows you to bake on your own schedule. It enhances and helps to develop flavor. It makes it easier to score when it's cold, and it provides better oven spring, which is the expansion of the bread when it hits the oven heat. And it most definitely helps to prevent over fermentation. There are some considerations. You want to make sure to cover it with plastic to prevent the dough from drying out. And also, the longer it retards, the more acidic it becomes, and it will develop more of a sour flavor. It's baking day, so we need to pull everything out. We need to bake our bread. We need good oven mitts. White rice flour if we want to do some decorative scoring. Semolina flour. A mister. A lamb or razor blade. A brush. A bread sling, either a silicone one or one that you made with parchment paper. We also need our baking vessel, which we can choose from a variety. I use this old cast iron Dutch oven that we see here in the center, or you can use a roasting pan, or you can pay a lot of money and buy one of these enameled cast iron bread ovens. Or you can use what you already have in your kitchen. Do you have a pizza stone and a oven-safe pot? Or perhaps, if not, a cookie sheet with a stainless bowl is going to work just as fine. This is how I set up for baking. I place a pizza stone on the lower rack, which helps to prevent the bottom of my loaves from burning. You know, there's many bakers that complain about the bottom of their loaves burning. So this can help to prevent that. You can also use a cookie sheet under the baking vessel on the lower rack. Now, we want a hot oven and a hot Dutch oven. So we preheat both of them for 1 hour in a 450-degree oven. Preheating the oven and the Dutch oven is crucial for successful sourdough baking, and here's why. Preheating, it ensures that the entire oven, including the walls and the racks, that they reach the desired temperature evenly. This uniform heat distribution promotes consistent baking results and helps your loaf to rise properly. Now, when baking sourdough, steam is essential for the crust development. Preheating the Dutch oven or your covered baking vessel, it allows it to retain the heat and the moisture. Now, once you place the dough inside, the trapped steam, it creates a humid environment and it results in a crisp golden crust. Now, during the initial minutes of baking, sourdough experiences oven spring. Now, this is when the dough rapidly expands due to the heat. In a preheated oven, it ensures that the dough encounters the right temperatures immediately, and it maximizes your oven spring and it achieves a lofty, well-risen loaf. We're going to keep the loaves in the refrigerator until it's time to score and bake. It is easier to score if you do not want the dough to overproof. Now, once the oven and your baking vessel and the lid have preheated for an hour, we're going to pull that loaf from the refrigerator and we're going to turn it out onto either a silicone bread sling or one that you made with parchment paper. Now, the sling, it allows you to move the loaf with ease in and out of the baking vessel. So to turn out the loaf from the proofing basket, you're going to first dust the top, which is actually the bottom of your baked loaf, with semolina flour. Now, semolina flour, it is used to prevent the dough from sticking to the sling when it's baking. So you're going to place the sling on top and gently flip the basket over. Now, I personally do not like excess flour on the top of my bread, so I will use a brush to remove as much of that white rice flour as possible. And I'm also going to remove it from the baking sling. I personally like the aesthetics of a shinier crust. Now, you can see that the dough did continue to rise during the cold retard. Next, we want to score the loaf. So we cut just under the skin and not too deep into the dough. So we hold the blade at a low 30 to 45 degree angle, and we make a single cut along the length of the dough. Now, the bread needs to expand without compromising the loaf structure. So cutting it too deep, it would cause the loaf to spread rather than rise. So remember to cut only through the skin. Now, the video didn't show it, but I also misted the first loaf generously with water. I then baked it before I proceeded with the second loaf. Now, for the second loaf, I kept it in the refrigerator until the first loaf was baked. Now, remember what I said previously? It is easier to score when it's cold, and we do not want to overproof the dough. I prefer to bake one loaf at a time. Now, for this loaf, I wanted to demonstrate decorative scoring. So I'm going to add additional white rice flour on top. Now, the flour, it will help the decorative scoring to stand out when it's baked. You can also do decorative scoring without the added flour, but it will not be as visible as when it's dusted with the flour. Now, we first score the loaf for the venting. Remember to only cut through the skin and not too deep. Then we will use shallow cuts for decorative purposes. Now, I have seen some beautifully scored breads. Now, some bakers, they are extremely creative with their scoring. Decorative scoring is a wonderful way to add a personal touch to your sourdough loaves. It can enhance the visual appeal of your bread. So decide on the pattern you want to create and plan it out on paper first. Simple lines, leaves, or wheat stalks, which is what I did here, are great for beginners. Remember to use very shallow cuts. Now, with practice, you will develop your own style and techniques. You will want to brush off the excess flour from the sling, and you brush as much flour out of the way before you're going to mist it, as this will make your cleanup much easier. Next, we will mist the loaf generously with water. We're going to use a spray bottle, and this will provide that extra moisture for the steaming process. And that is what helps to develop the oven spring, and it also develops a shinier crust. I have preheated the Dutch oven with its lid at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour. And I will quickly place the loaf into the hot Dutch oven. I'll cover it and I'll bake it at 450 for 20 minutes to facilitate the steaming process. And after 20 minutes, I will remove that lid and I will finish the bake for another 10 to 15 minutes. Now, at the 10-minute mark, check the temperature at the center of the loaf. It should register between 207 to 210. And if necessary, extend the baking time to reach your desired temperature. Now, during this time, the internal part of the loaf, it will continue to bake and the crust will develop its beautiful color. I personally like my bread at 210. The loaf has a beautiful color and the loaf should sound hollow when you tap it on the bottom. So we place the loaf on a cooling rack to cool. Now we are going to cool the loaf completely on a wire rack. And before slicing it with a serrated bread knife, we want to make sure it is cool. The inside of the loaf, it continues to cook for some time after it's been removed from the oven. So we want to make sure to allow it to cool completely before we cut into it. I know it's the most difficult part because we are so eager to see the crumb and we want to smother it with butter to devour it. However, you do need to try to give it at least an hour. Now, this bread has some great oven spring and ear. Now, the ear is highly sought after by many bakers. And to achieve an ear, everything has to be precise. The proofing and the bulk fermentation must not be under or overproofed. The loaf must be sufficiently tightened during the shaping to create that tension. And great oven spring, also skilled scoring, it all contributes to that ear. However, remember, a loaf, it does not need an ear to be a great loaf. Now, we're going to get into these excellent English muffins. Now, English muffins became a staple in American breakfast. It's often used in dishes like Eggs Benedict, which is one of my favorite. And they are known for their soft, airy interior and the slightly crunchy exterior. Interesting enough, English muffins are more popular in the US than they are in the UK, where they are often referred to as the American muffin. Once you have eaten these English muffins, you will never buy store muffins again. I want to warn you, it is time consuming, but you and your family, you are going to appreciate the love and the time that you put into making these. Now, the recipe that's on the website has bread flour, milk, honey, eggs, and salt, and it creates this beautiful English muffin. So the schedule that I have when I make my English muffins is on day one, I make that leaven. I pull my starter out of the refrigerator at 8:30. And based upon my kitchen's ambient temperature of 78 during the summertime, my feeding ratio is a 1:3:3. And that allows me on day to make my dough starting at 8:30 to 9 o'clock. I'll then do my stretch and folds and I'll bulk ferment. I'll place it in the refrigerator and cold retard it. So it can retard for, anywhere from 12 to 48 hours. And I like going 36 hours because I like the flavor it develops. So on the day that I bake, I will shape my muffins. It'll bench rest for approximately 2 hours, and then I'll bake the muffins. We have already completed the dough mixing, fermentation, and autolyse, and 3 sets of stretch and folds. Now this is the 4th and it's the final set of stretch and folds for this batch of English muffins. Remember to wet your hands to handle your dough to prevent sticking. Now the dough has undergone a total bench fermentation of 2 hours, which included a half hour of the autolyse and 3 prior sets of stretch and folds, each 30 minutes apart. So we're going to continue with the stretching and the folding, and we're going to rotate the bowl, stretching and folding until there is very little stretch left in the dough. As always, we will turn the dough seam side down to rest, and we're going to cover it to prevent the dough from drying out. Next, we're going to place it in the refrigerator for its cold retard. Now, the cold retard, it can go from 12 to 48 hours. The longer the retard, the more pronounced sour flavor is going to become. I allowed the dough to retard for 36 hours. Now the dough has fermented nicely during this time. We're going to use flour, and we're going to flour the work surface and use a silicone bowl scraper to turn out the dough onto the work surface. 36 hours of cold retard, it provided me with the right amount of time to develop the flavor I was after. With sourdough, the longer it cold retards, it will result in a more sour flavor. Now, the benefit of cold retard allows the time for that flavor to develop without over fermenting. We will use flour, not water, during this process to handle the dough. You will need a scale to weigh the dough for consistent size muffins. I cut the dough into pieces with my kitchen shears. I weigh each muffin between 109 and 110. And you should get about 24 muffins. And that would be 109 to 110 grams. English muffins, they have an interesting history that spans both sides of the Atlantic. Now, despite their name, they were actually invented in the U.S. by a British man named Samuel Bath Thomas. He immigrated from Plymouth, England to New York City in 1874, and he began making a thinner cut version of crumpets, which he called toaster crumpets. And by 1880, Thomas had opened his own bakery in New York City, where he created great popularity. Now, these muffins, they were different from the traditional crumpets, as they were made from a firmer dough and they were split down the middle using a fork. And in 1926, Thomas trademarked his creation as the English muffin. As I form each ball, I will roll it in my hands to shape and stretch the dough. And after forming each ball, I roll it in cornmeal. Now, cornmeal is sprinkled on English muffins before cooking for several reasons. It helps to prevent the dough from sticking to the cooking surface, whether it's a griddle, a skillet, or a baking sheet. And it makes it easier to handle and flip the muffins without damaging their shape. Now, the cornmeal, it adds a pleasant, slightly crunchy texture to the outside of the English muffin. And this contrast, it enhances the overall eating experience by adding a subtle crunch to the soft, airier interior. Now, cornmeal, it gives English muffins their characteristic appearance. The fine yellow granules are part of the traditional look of English muffins that we expect. Now, while the flavor contribution of cornmeal is minimal, it does add a mild, slightly sweet note, and it complements the flavor of the muffins without overpowering it. And by using cornmeal, we can achieve the classic texture, appearance, and functionality that make English muffins very distinctive. Somehow, I ended up with only 23 muffins. So you will want to cover them with a tea towel and let them proof until they have doubled, which takes about 2 hours in a 79-degree ambient kitchen. You want to preheat an oven to 350 and also preheat a skillet with a lid to medium heat. And this is my 45-year-old electric skillet, and it still works like a charm. I will cook the muffins in batches of 4. I'm going to place the muffins in the skillet, cover them, and cook them for 3 to 4 minutes until they are a nice golden color. Next, I will turn and cook the other side for the same amount of time. Now, this step, it only browns and it creates that crispy exterior, and it partially cooks the muffins, leaving the inside soft and airy. Notice how nicely the muffins have puffed up. They are definitely thick, and they make those store-bought muffins look very wimpy. We will then place the batch on a baking tray to finish them off in the oven. In a preheated oven of 350 degrees Fahrenheit, we will bake each batch for 6 to 10 minutes or until the internal temperature reaches 207 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit. We want to transfer the muffins to a cooling rack and allow them to cool completely. Here is my finished bake. We fork split English muffins. Now, fork splitting, it creates a rough, uneven surface inside the muffin, resulting in a more interesting texture when it's toasted. Now, the nooks and crannies, it'll hold the butter, jam, and other toppings better. Now, this method, it promotes even browning and crisping. It maintains that classic characteristics of an English muffin. It also ensures that the muffin cooks evenly and it retains its distinctive texture, giving it a unique look and feel. Now, since it's just my husband and myself, I'll place the muffins in a freezer Ziploc bag and I will freeze them. And when we're ready to eat the muffin, I will take one out at a time, microwave it for 30 seconds, and defrost it before I fork split and I toast them. There are signs to look for to know when your dough is ready. We never want to under or over ferment. Over fermented dough is when the yeast has consumed all of the available food and the gluten network in the dough becomes too weak to hold the gases that are produced by the yeast. It causes the dough to collapse and deflate. And the crust may turn out pale because the dough has been exhausted of its sugars. And that's what's needed for proper browning during the baking. And the bread's crumb structure, it can become tight and dense with smaller holes compared to a properly proofed loaf. You may also notice an off flavor described as alcoholic. In underproofing, it results in a loaf that is dense and it's flat. And this happens because the dough hasn't had enough time to develop the gases that's needed to rise it properly. And as a result, the bread will have a tight crumb structure, meaning the holes in the bread will be very small and close together. And it leads to a less airy texture. Additionally, the flavor of the bread may be less developed, lacking the complexity that comes from a longer fermentation process. Now, these are the various ways to determine the proper fermentation stage. There is the bubble and the volume. You're looking for large and small bubble formation and the expansion of that dough. Now, the poke test, you're going to use a wet finger and you're going to poke it into the dough. It's not ready if the hole fills up quickly, and it's ready if the hole starts to fill back up, but not completely. And it's over fermented if there's no change, or it does not start to fill back up, or it takes a really long time for it to fill. Now, there's the window pane. You're going to use wet fingers. You're going to grab a hunk of the dough and you're going to pull it up. And what you're looking for is a thin sheet that you can see the light through. There's also the smell test. So what you're looking for is when it smells slightly acidic and like yeast and bread. But you don't want it to smell very strong or like vinegar. Now, also the jiggle test, and this is not for your low hydration doughs. So for what I provided on the website, which is a low to medium, it really isn't going to give you that jiggle that your high hydration does. But for your higher hydration dough, it'll be ready if it jiggles like Jell-O. Let's now look into sourdough hydration and how it affects both the dough handling and the final bake. Hydration refers to the percentage of water relative to the flour in your sourdough recipe. Now, with your lower and medium hydration levels, it's a stiffer dough. It's easier to work with, especially for beginners. It requires less effort to incorporate ingredients. The gluten development, it takes longer. It may need more stretching than your higher hydration recipes. And fermentation time can be longer. It's less sticky, but it is more manageable. And your higher hydration, it's more challenging to work with. It is sticky and it's slack. It requires gentle handling. Your higher hydration is more challenging to handle. It's sticky and slack. It requires a gentle handling. However, it creates a thinner and crispier crust. So with the baked result, lower hydration, it gives you a chewier crumb, a thicker crust, and your higher hydrations give you a lighter, more open crumb and a thin, crispier crust. As you gain experience, feel free to experiment with the different hydration levels to find your sweet spot. Baker's percentages, also known as baker's math, are a way to express the proportions of ingredients in a bread recipe relative to the weight of the flour and the ingredient amounts without affecting the overall recipe. Baker's percentages are particularly relevant in sourdough bread making because they allow bakers to precisely control that hydration level and other ingredients. Let's look at a 68% hydration sourdough bread recipe using a 100% hydration starter. This recipe will yield a loaf with a balanced crumb structure and a delightful crust. This is also the recipe that I provided for you on our website. The recipe calls for 150 grams of 100% hydrated leaven, which is 75 grams of flour and 75 grams of water. The recipe for one loaf is 375 grams of flour and 231 grams of water and 10 grams of salt. And that gives us a total weight of 450 grams of flour, 306 grams of water, and 10 grams of salt. So to get our percentages, the formula is we take our water grams of 306 and we divide that by our flour grams of 450, and then we multiply that by 100. So our hydration level is 68%. Our salt is 2%. So we take 10 grams of salt, we divide it by 450 grams of flour, and we multiply that by 100, and it gives us 2%. So this recipe, our salt grams are 2%. All right, that wraps it up for this session. Next session, coming up in August, is our interactive session. I want you to share pictures of your bakes. We want to celebrate your triumphs, and we'll also do some troubleshooting. So to be included in that, prior to August the 23rd, I want you to use this link to upload your pictures, your comments, your questions, and that would be ucanr.edu /capital M, capital F, capital P, sourdough. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you at our next session.